Let me tell you about the night a duke made the worst decision of his life, and didn't know it until she was already gone. He was powerful, admired, the kind of man entire rooms reorganized themselves around. She was a companion, educated, penniless, and far too perceptive for her own comfort in that world. They had spent months building something extraordinary together. Ideas, reforms, and the quiet, dangerous understanding of two people who recognized each other completely. And then, in front of everyone who mattered to him, he chose his title over her soul. "You are unworthy of my name." What he never calculated, what powerful men so rarely do, is what happens when the woman they underestimated stops waiting for them to change their mind. The autumn of 1814 had been the season of Maria Dawson's most precise education. Not in letters, which she had long mastered, but in the particular cruelty of a world that admired a clever woman and rewarded a wealthy one. And at 22, Maria had no title to present and no fortune to recommend her. She was the daughter of Edmund Dawson, once a celebrated scholar of considerable reputation, whose name had decorated the libraries of gentlemen who would no longer receive her in their drawing rooms. The debt that consumed him had been swift and total. What remained of the Dawson name was a faint and fading perfume, elegant enough to be remembered, powerless enough to be ignored. She was not what society called beautiful. Not in the immediate, blazing way that commanded attention across a ballroom. But those who looked, truly looked, found something harder to dismiss than prettiness. Dark eyes that moved through a room the way a scholar moves through a text, missing nothing, cataloguing everything. A stillness of bearing that came not from submission, but from the habit of self-possession learned under pressure. And she had been composing herself in difficult rooms for years. It showed, and not unattractively. She had not expected, when she took her position as companion in the Whitmore household, to be seen at all. Companions were furniture, useful, present, and decorative in their invisibility. She had expected the library, vast, unsupervised, and magnificent, and she had expected nothing beyond it. Then Arthur Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshaw, had come to dine. He was not what rumor had built. The rumor had constructed a man of cold efficiency. Brilliant, yes, but sealed against sentiment the way a well-made estate is sealed against winter. What Maria observed across a dinner table when a foolish young lord made a pronouncement about the uselessness of educating tenant farmers was something rumor had omitted entirely. The Duke's jaw tightening, his glass set down with quiet precision, and his eyes moving, not to the speaker, but to her, the companion in the corner, she who had looked up from her needlework with an expression that said he is wrong, and he will never know it. He had sought her out before the evening was over. "You disagreed with Lord Fenwick," he had said. Not a question. His voice was low, accustomed to making rooms lean toward it. "I should like to know why," she had told him, plainly, with evidence. He had come back the following Tuesday, not to dine, but to continue the argument, where their conversations had become a private country between two people who had no right to share one. Evenings in the ducal library, candlelight moving across spines of books they both knew by name, debating estate reform, the economics of rural literacy, the question of whether education was charity or investment. He had listened to her the way men in this world rarely listen to women, not waiting for her to finish, but thinking while she spoke, his responses shaped by what she had actually said. She had not known until Arthur Blackwood how hungry she was to be genuinely heard. "You see what most men in Parliament refuse to see," he had told her once, a letter from his estate agent still open in his hand. "That the ignorance of the poor is not God's design, it is ours, and it is costing us more than we admit." She had allowed herself, in her most unguarded moments, to believe this was more than intellectual regard, and to imagine that what passed between them in those quiet hours, the leaning close over ledgers, the shared silences, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, was the beginning of something society had no category for, something rare and equal. Then the engagement was announced. Lady Cecilia Hargrove, daughter of the Earl of Montclair, 30,000 a year, and a lineage that stretched unbroken to the Norman conquest. The match was, by every aristocratic measure, perfect, and it had been arranged, quietly and decisively, while Maria was still organizing the ducal library and believing she understood the man who owned it. She had heard the news from a parlor maid. She had returned to her work the same afternoon. She told herself it was clarity, the bracing, useful kind. She told herself she had never expected anything, that she was a paid companion and a duke was a duke, and the distance between those two facts was the whole of England's history. And she told herself many reasonable things, in the sensible, educated voice she had cultivated through years of needing it. And then, at the Harrington Ball, the grandest evening of the winter season, in a room full of the most powerful witnesses England could provide, Arthur Blackwood had looked at her across the marble floor, in a moment she had not asked for, and could not refuse, and the whole careful architecture of her reasonableness had meant nothing at all. The music was still playing, and he had crossed the room. She had known, in the way she always knew things before others admitted them, what was about to happen. She had just not known, until the words came, how much it would cost him too. Maria Dawson had not always understood the price of a name. That education had begun long before the Duke, in a narrow house in Bath, with a father who loved books more than balance sheets, and a world that offered no forgiveness for the difference. The second Tuesday became a third, and the third became a standing arrangement that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging what it was. Arthur sent no formal invitation. He simply appeared in the library at 7 o'clock, as though drawn by some force more reliable than manners, removed his coat, set it over the back of a chair with the ease of a man in his own home, which, of course, he was, and picked up the argument precisely where they had left it. And Maria learned to expect him the way one expects weather, not always welcome, never quite ignorable. Their discussions had moved beyond the polite boundaries of dinner-table reform. They spoke now of specific things. The particular failure of the Ravenshire tenant school, abandoned for 3 years for want of a qualified teacher and the will to find one. The economics of modern crop rotation and why half his farmers were exhausting land their grandfathers had worked in abundance. The quiet, the grinding indignity of men who labored their entire lives in fields they would never own, for landlords who debated their welfare in rooms they would never enter. Arthur listened the way he made decisions, completely and with an unsettling lack of ego about being wrong. The school cannot function on goodwill alone, Maria had told him one evening, a map of the Ravenshire estate spread between them like a shared country. So the farmers won't send their children if the harvest demands the children's hands. You need a schedule built around the agricultural calendar, not the academic one. He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had written it down. Within a fortnight, his correspondence with the estate steward had begun to carry ideas that were not entirely his own. He did not say so. Maria did not expect him to. She understood that credit, in this world, moved in one direction, upward, toward the people already elevated enough to receive it. What mattered to her was not attribution. It was that the thing got done. But the doing of it required more evenings, more maps, more arguments that spilled past the hour when a companion ought to have retired and a duke ought to have had somewhere else to be. The servants noticed first. They always did. Mrs. Hargrove, the Whitmore housekeeper, who had said nothing directly, she was too practiced for directness. But Maria had observed the woman's particular quality of silence when Arthur's carriage was noted in the drive for the 3rd time in a week. She had observed the way the parlor maid lingered in the hall outside the library door a fraction longer than a candlestick required. She had observed the careful, kind expression on Lady Whitmore's face at breakfast. the expression of a woman choosing, very deliberately, not to ask a question. Maria observed all of this. She catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, quietly, without reaction, and with the full understanding of what it meant. Arthur, to his considerable credit and considerable peril, observed none of it. He arrived on a Thursday evening, an unscheduled evening, which was new, with a leather folio under his arm and the look of a man who had already decided something before he walked through the door. "The estate records," he said, setting the folio on the table between them. 3 decades of accounts, incomplete, inconsistent, and largely illegible. He paused. "I need them reorganized." He did not phrase it as a question. He did not quite meet her eyes when he said it. "That is a steward's work, Your Grace," Maria said carefully. "Yes," Arthur agreed. "It is." He did not withdraw the folio. The announcement appeared in the morning papers on a Wednesday. Maria read it in the Whitmore breakfast room, between a report on parliamentary proceedings and an advertisement for a milliner on Bond Street. A single column, 12 lines. The engagement of Arthur Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshire, to Lady Cecilia Hargrove, daughter of the Earl of Montclair, a union welcomed by both families as a natural consolidation of 2 great English houses. Natural, as though it had grown that way, unprompted, like something from good soil. Maria finished her tea. She folded the paper along its original crease. She went upstairs and began the estate correspondence Arthur had left with her the previous Thursday. She did not permit herself a single unproductive feeling until that evening, alone in her room, when she allowed herself precisely 10 minutes of honesty, and then put it away like a winter coat in April. Stored, unnecessary, not discarded, but not worn. What followed was, in its way, the strangest weeks of her life. Arthur said nothing of the engagement when he came, but he arrived as he always had, folio under his arm, conversation already forming, and Maria understood that she was expected to continue as before. She did. She was very good at continuing. She helped him reimagine the Ravenshire schoolroom for the tenants' children. She drew a calendar around the harvest. She wrote letters to 2 qualified schoolmasters in Bristol on his behalf. She suggested which rooms in the East Wing might be opened to give the future Duchess a suite worthy of receiving county guests, and which renovation would cost least while appearing to cost most. She was, in every practical sense, preparing his home for another woman's arrival. She was precise about it, methodical, and if there was something unbearable in the precision, she had long ago learned that unbearable things were most safely approached through method, and it was the candlelight that undid the careful arrangement. A Thursday evening, late. The rest of the house had long settled. The fire had burned low, and neither of them had moved to add wood, as though stillness was preferable to the disruption of standing. The estate plans were spread between them. His hand rested near hers on the map. Not touching, but near enough that the nearness was its own kind of statement. He said, and without looking up, "You make me forget who I am expected to be." Not a declaration. Not quite, but more honest than a declaration, and therefore more dangerous. Maria looked at the map, at the careful lines of a world that had already decided what both of them were. She knew in that moment, with the complete and terrible clarity she had always been cursed with, exactly how much he meant it. She knew, too, that meaning it would never be enough. She gathered the papers on her side of the table, stacked them, straightened them. "I believe that is sufficient for this evening," she said quietly. "Maria, Your Grace," she corrected. The title fell between them like a closed door. She did not look back as she left. The Harrington Ball was the kind of event that London assembled itself around. Chandeliers burning at full extravagance, the air thick with perfume and ambition, and every conversation a performance for an audience that was simultaneously performing for you. Maria stood near the far wall in dove grey, which was the correct colour for a companion, present enough to be useful, muted enough to be forgettable. She had dressed with particular care that evening, though she would not have admitted why. Her gloves were her best pair, white, immaculate. Arthur arrived late, as powerful men are permitted to do. Lady Cecilia was on his arm, gold silk, pale hair, the effortless composure of a woman who had never once needed to construct herself under pressure. She was not unkind. Maria had decided that early and stuck to it as a matter of fairness. Lady Cecilia was simply everything the world had agreed to reward. The evening moved as such evenings do, in slow, glittering rotations. Maria fetched a shawl. She confirmed a supper arrangement. She existed correctly at the room's edge. It was Lord Ashby who began it, and he was the particular kind of nobleman whose confidence had never once been tested by consequence. Broad-shouldered, loud in the way of men who had never needed to listen, positioned near the refreshment table with two companions who shared his quality of comfortable cruelty. "Ravenshire's little scholar," he said not quietly as Maria passed. "Tell me, does she file his correspondence before or after she files her ambitions?" The laughter was immediate and male and designed to carry. Now, the music did not stop, but the conversations nearest to them did, one by one, like candles meeting a draught. Maria stilled. She did not turn. She had faced worse in smaller rooms with less dignity available to her, and she knew, with the bone-deep knowledge of long practice, that her stillness was the only weapon she was permitted. Then Arthur was there. He had crossed the floor. She had not seen him move, but suddenly he was present, and when the room recalibrated around him the way rooms do around men of his consequence. Lord Ashby straightened. The laughter died. Every eye in the nearest radius found them. Arthur looked at her. Directly, for one long, terrible moment, and in it Maria saw the full interior of his conflict as clearly as she had ever read anything. She saw him understand what the moment required. She watched him make the choice. His voice, when it came, was measured and carrying and final. "You are unworthy of my name." The room exhaled. Maria's white glove slipped from her hand. She did not retrieve it. She looked at him, not with devastation, which would have given the room too much, but with the specific, sorrowful recognition of a woman whose prediction has just been confirmed. She curtsied, precisely, to herself, not to him. Then she walked toward the open doors at the far end of the ballroom, through the cool dark of the threshold, and out into the night, and without tears. He returned to Ravenshire the following morning. He told himself it was estate business. There was always estate business. Correspondence requiring signature, accounts requiring review, the endless administrative machinery of a dukedom that stopped for nothing, including its owner's conscience. He told himself this with the practiced conviction of a man accustomed to believing what was useful. He went directly to the library, and the books were stacked on the table nearest the window. His books, the ones he had brought her over the preceding months, selected without entirely admitting he was selecting them. Locke, Smith, Wollstonecraft, which he had included almost as a provocation, and which she had read in 4 days and returned with marginalia so precise they had altered his thinking, stacked now with a neatness that was itself a kind of statement, returned, complete, nothing outstanding. Beside them were the estate plans, rolled, tied, labeled in her handwriting. Every document she had touched was here, every map annotated in her careful hand, everything given back, and on top, weighted by a small brass paperweight she had borrowed and never mentioned returning, a sealed letter. He did not open it immediately. He stood in the room that had held their evenings, the low fire, the arguments, and the particular quality of silence that existed only between two people who understood each other. and he felt the absence of her, the way one feels the removal of a splint, the sudden exposure of something that had been quietly, essentially, held together. He opened the letter. It was not about him. That was the first thing that struck him, and the thing that undid him most completely. It was her final proposal for the Ravenshire Tenant School. 6 pages, precise and thorough, detailing a full academic calendar, a recommended hiring process for schoolmasters, a funding model drawn from a state surplus that would sustain the program for a decade without strain. She had included letters of introduction to 2 qualified educators in Bristol, already written, requiring only his signature. She had finished the work. She had finished it, left it behind, and walked out of his life. And her last act had been to ensure the children of his tenants would learn to read. Arthur sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, which was available. On the floor beneath the window, with her letter across his knees, in a posture that no Duke of Ravenshire had likely assumed in the history of the title. The paperweight was still in his hand. He did not recall picking it up. He said her name. Not Miss Dawson, not said with rank or occasion or the careful modulation of public life. Maria. Just that. Into an empty room. As though saying it plainly, without armor, which was the only honest thing he had done in months. He sent for his solicitor the following morning. The engagement to Lady Cecilia Hargrove was formally dissolved by the end of the week. He wrote to Maria the same day. The letter was returned unopened. Time, Arthur discovered, did not heal so much as it rearranged. The grief did not diminish. It simply found more sophisticated places to live. In the particular quiet of the library at 7 o'clock on Tuesday evenings. In the instinct, still not entirely extinguished after 2 years, to turn and share an observation with someone who was no longer in the room. In the way he sometimes caught himself reaching for an argument he wanted to have, and finding no one on the other side of it worth the effort. He threw himself into the work. It was the only honest inheritance of what they had built together, and so he protected it with the obsessive care of a man who has lost the architect and refuses to lose the building. The Ravenshire Tenant School opened in the spring of 1816, 14 months after Maria had left its blueprints on the library table. He signed the letters she had pre-addressed. He hired the schoolmasters she had recommended. He implemented the calendar she had designed around the harvest. He did not alter a single structural element of her proposal, because he understood, with the clarity that comes too late and stays forever, that he could not have improved it. The school was considered a model of progressive estate management. Agricultural journals wrote about it. Reform-minded MPs cited it in parliamentary debate. Arthur received the credit with the composed, slightly distant expression he had perfected over years of public life, and said nothing about where the thinking had originated. He funded 3 more schools over the following years, in Wiltshire, in Yorkshire, and in a small market town in Derbyshire, where the land was poor and the landlords historically indifferent. Anonymous endowments administered through a solicitor, attached to no name. He told himself this was discretion. He knew it was penance. Politically, he thrived, which is the particular punishment available to capable men who have made themselves emotionally unavailable. He rose. He was consulted, and he sat on committees and chaired inquiries and spoke in the Lords with the measured authority of someone who had read everything and felt, lately, very little. His name was spoken with the specific reverence reserved for men of unimpeachable public conduct and unknowable private life. Respect, he learned, could be maintained indefinitely through competence and self-control. It was also, he learned, completely hollow, and he was seated in the visitors' gallery of the House of Commons on a grey November afternoon, present for a debate on rural education reform, when he heard it. A backbench MP from the Midlands, making the case for a proposed schools bill, gestured to a recently published pamphlet as evidence of the model's proven effectiveness. His voice carried cleanly to the gallery. I refer the House to the findings of Miss Maria Dawson. founder of the Dawson Academy for Girls, and the most coherent thinker on the question of rural literacy this country has yet produced. The chamber murmured its approval. Arthur sat very still. Her name, spoken in Parliament with admiration by men who had never once asked whether she was worthy of anything, and had simply discovered, without his assistance, that she was. He stared at the floor of the gallery for a long moment. Then he asked the attendant beside him for a copy of the pamphlet. Maria Dawson did not set out to become remarkable. She set out, in the winter of 1815, to find a room she could afford in a town that did not know her history, and to be useful in it. Remarkability, she had always believed, was largely a matter of doing necessary things in places where no one else had thought to do them yet. The world was full of necessary things. One simply had to be willing to do the work without waiting for permission. She found her room in Ipswich. She found, shortly after, a disused schoolroom attached to a Methodist chapel whose congregation was sympathetic to the education of girls, provided someone else organized it. She organized it. She taught the first class herself. 11 girls between the ages of 7 and 14, daughters of tradesmen and farmers, and one apothecary who had no sons and had decided, with admirable pragmatism, that his daughter would have to do. She taught them to read with precision and to write with argument. And she taught arithmetic not as an abstract discipline, but as the specific, practical language of financial independence. How to manage accounts, how to understand a contract, how to identify the precise mechanism by which a woman without education becomes a woman without options. She taught them, in other words, what she wished someone had taught her earlier, before the world had been permitted to define her circumstances without her consent. Word traveled, as word about useful things eventually does. By 1817, the Dawson Academy occupied a proper building, leased at favorable terms from a reform-minded landowner who had read her first published pamphlet on the education of women as a matter of national interest, and written to her directly. The pamphlet had circulated further than she expected, and had been cited in quarters she had not anticipated, including, as she was told by a colleague who followed parliamentary proceedings more closely than she did, the House of Commons. She had noted this without comment and returned to her work. The academy grew. She hired 3 teachers, 2 of them former students of limited means but considerable ability, whom she paid fairly and credited publicly, because she understood that the habit of erasing women's contributions began in precisely the institutions meant to elevate them. She advised 2 parliamentary committees on rural literacy. She corresponded with reformers in Edinburgh and Bristol, and was twice invited to London to speak, which she did, clearly without apology, and to rooms that were surprised by her and then persuaded. She was calm in a way she had not always been. Not the performed composure of the Whitmore household, the careful stillness of a woman managing her own visibility, but something quieter and more permanent. So the composure of someone who has built the ground they are standing on and knows its foundations. She did not speak of the Duke of Ravenshire. Not because the subject wounded her beyond speaking. She had long ago done the private work of that. But because he was not relevant to the life she was describing when people asked about her. The academy was relevant. Her students were relevant. The question of whether a girl born without fortune was entitled to an independent mind was extremely relevant. Arthur Blackwood was a chapter she had closed neatly and shelved in a part of the library she no longer visited. She was 30 years old. She was respected. She was, by every measure that had ever been applied to her, more than sufficient. The opening of the Academy's second building in the spring of 1819 was attended by local dignitaries, to 3 members of the County Education Board, and a journalist from a Bristol Gazette who had requested an interview. Maria was speaking with a parent near the entrance when she noticed, at the edge of the gathered crowd, a figure she had not expected and had not invited. He was not in ducal dress. He wore no insignia of rank. He stood apart from the crowd with his hands behind his back, the way he had always stood when he was thinking rather than performing. watching the building as though he were reading it. He had come without announcement. He had come, it appeared, without any clear idea of what he intended to say. Maria looked at him for precisely 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the parent beside her, smiled, and continued her sentence exactly where she had left it. He waited until the crowd had thinned. That, Maria noted, was new. And the Arthur Blackwood she had known had never waited for a room to empty before making his presence felt. He had been the kind of man rooms reorganized themselves around the moment he entered. That he stood now at the periphery of her afternoon, patient and unannounced, suggested something had shifted in the fundamental architecture of him. She finished her conversation with the journalist. She thanked the members of the education board. She walked the last departing guests to the door with the unhurried courtesy of a woman entirely in command of her own time. Then she turned. He had not moved from the edge of the courtyard. When their eyes met, he did not assume she would approach him. He crossed the distance himself. "Miss Dawson," he said. "Not my dear." Not the unconscious ownership of his former manner. Simply her name, with the full weight of someone who had been practicing the right to use it plainly. Your Grace," she said. Something moved briefly across his face at that. Recognition, perhaps, of the title as the distance it had always been. "I wonder," he said carefully, "whether you might allow me a few minutes. I will not take more than you are willing to give." She considered him. He looked well. Political success had a particular way of preserving men, keeping them purposeful and presentable. But there was something underneath the preservation, and a quality of long-carried weight that she recognized, because she had watched it develop in him from its earliest origins, in a library, by candlelight, before either of them had understood the cost of what they were building. "The garden," she said. "There is a bench." They sat with appropriate distance between them and the sounds of the departing afternoon at their backs. He did not begin with justification. She had half expected justification. An architecture of context, and political necessity, the pressures of his position arranged carefully to distribute the weight of what he had done. He had always been intelligent enough to construct a good argument. He was apparently, now, intelligent enough not to. "I said something to you," he began, "that I have not been able to unsay. I'm not here to explain it. I'm here because there is no version of my life in which that moment does not require me to face you directly and tell you that it was wrong. Not inconvenient. Not regrettable. Wrong." Maria said nothing. She had learned over years of listening to men in parliamentary committees that silence was frequently more useful than response. "My name was the only thing I had," he continued, his voice low and without performance. "I had built nothing beneath it, earned nothing independent of it. You were—" He stopped. Began again. "You were the only thing I was. Not the title. Not the legacy. The man who existed in that library, who thought more clearly with you than he had ever thought alone." He paused. "I destroyed that man publicly to protect a name. I've spent 5 years determining whether the exchange was rational." "And?" Maria asked. "It was not." The garden was quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cart moved along the road. "I'm not asking to restore what was," he said. "I understand that is not available to me, and I'm not certain I would deserve it if it were. And I'm asking—" He turned to look at her directly, the way he had always looked at her, without the management he applied to everyone else. "Whether there is any form of partnership in the work you are doing in which I might be useful, on your terms, under your direction." Maria looked at the Academy building, her building, her name above the door in plain, unadorned lettering. She thought about the 11 girls in a Methodist schoolroom, and about the pamphlet that had reached Parliament without his assistance, about the particular freedom of a life that owed nothing to anyone's approval of it. She thought, too, and she was honest enough to admit this, at least to herself, about a map spread between them on a library table, and a man who had written down her ideas and looked at her as though she were the most interesting thing in his world. "You have funded schools," she said, anonymously. He said nothing, which was confirmation. 3, I am told, possibly 4. Still nothing. That was not nothing, Arthur. His name, without the title, fell into the space between them with the weight of everything it had previously cost her to withhold. She turned to face him. "If I had truly been unworthy," she said quietly, "why did you never forget me?" He did not answer immediately, which was, Maria thought, the most honest thing he could have done, and a lesser man, or the earlier version of him, would have produced a response designed to close the question efficiently. Arthur sat with it the way she had watched him sit with difficult problems in the estate ledgers, fully, without the vanity of pretending it was simple. "Because," he said at last, "you were the only person who ever made me want to be worth knowing." The garden held the silence without discomfort. Maria looked at her hands in her lap. She had ink on her right forefinger. She almost always did these days, the particular occupational mark of a woman who wrote more than she had ever been expected to. She had stopped trying to remove it. "I've thought about this," she said. "Not obsessively, but honestly, the way I think about problems I haven't solved yet. And I've arrived at several conclusions." She turned to look at him with a directness that had once made dinner companions uneasy and had, she was fairly certain, been one of the first things about her that had caught his attention. "The first is that I have built something here that is entirely mine. My name above the door. My ideas in its foundations. My students in its classrooms. That does not change. Not for anyone. Not under any arrangement." "I would not ask it to," Arthur said. And the absence of hesitation in his voice told her he had already decided this before he arrived. "The second," she continued, "is that I am no longer interested in being someone's private understanding. If you are in my life, you are in my life. In public, without management or careful positioning or the particular social arithmetic that powerful men apply to women they admire but will not claim." "That is reasonable," he said. Though they both understood it was not merely reasonable. It was, in his world, a considerable undertaking. He said it anyway. Maria was quiet for a moment. "The third," she said, and her voice shifted. Not softer, exactly, but less constructed, "is that I have been doing important work, and I intend to continue doing it, and I find I would rather do it alongside someone who understands it than entirely alone." She paused. "You understand it, insufferably well, in fact. You always did." Something in him, the long-carried weight she had observed earlier, shifted visibly, like a house settling after years of tension. "I'm not asking you to forgive me quickly," he said. "I'm asking permission to spend a significant amount of time earning a different answer than the one I deserve." "You already have permission for that," Maria said. "You purchased it anonymously in Wiltshire and Yorkshire and Derbyshire." She rose from the bench, straightening her dress with the calm efficiency of a woman who had somewhere to be. "Come. Now, there is a meeting with the county board tomorrow morning, and if you intend to be useful, you should understand what we are asking them to fund." Arthur stood. He did not offer his arm in the way of formal escort. He fell into step beside her, level, unhurried, the way two people walk when neither is leading, toward the open doors of the academy building. Society noted, in the months that followed, the Duke of Ravenshire's association with the Dawson Academy. It was discussed in drawing rooms with a particular energy reserved for arrangements that defied easy categorization. He attended her public lectures. He testified before parliamentary committees on her behalf. He walked beside her, not ahead, not as patron surveying an investment, but as a man in the presence of work he respected and a person he had learned, at considerable cost, to be worthy of. She remained Maria Dawson. That was not a concession, it was the point. Years later, And when the academy had grown into a network of 6 schools, when her pamphlets had shaped 2 pieces of parliamentary legislation, when her name was cited in educational circles across England and beyond, the record showed simply this. A duke had once declared a woman unworthy of his name. History, in its patient and precise way, had taken note of both of them. It remembered his title. It remembered her legacy. It understood correctly which of the 2 had proven more durable. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.